This is News Fighters
Book Club,
where we fight the news so you don't have to. With Dylan Behan.
Hello Fighters, and welcome to another edition of the News Fighters Don't Sue Me Oprah Book Club. Now, we're right in the middle of the election season, and one issue I wanted to talk about in some depth this election campaign was education, and how our education system seems to have gone backward since Julia Gillard and the Gonski reforms. Now, unfortunately, I don't know much about the education system. I was barely educated myself. I did some homeschooling. That's why English no good for me bad, sometimes maths either. So I did find someone who does know something about the Australian education system. In fact, he wrote a book about it called Waiting for Gonski, How Australia Failed at Schools. Yes, I was lucky enough to interview one of the co-authors of that book, by Tom Greenwell and Chris Bonner. Tom Greenwell, who had a chat with me about the book and about how Australian school funding, federal funding, has gone backwards since Julia Gillard and Gonski. And it's a fascinating read, a real scary horror story about how Australia's very unique in the world in how it funds its schools and how it kind of keeps digging a hole backwards on school funding due to political pressures. Very, very interesting book and very apt this election campaign when education should be talked about a lot more, if you ask me. So here he is. I chatted to him a couple of weeks ago. Tom Greenwell, author of Waiting for Gonski. All right, joining me now on News Fighters is one of the authors of the great new book, Waiting for Gonski, How Australia Failed at Schools. Joining me now is Tom Greenwell. Tom, it's a fascinating book. It's kind of a real-life horror story detailing the history of school funding in Australia and why it's kind of evolved badly and keeps getting stuffed up. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, if you take the situation we're in now, the Gonski report 10 years ago said we need to spend smarter. We need to allocate school funding according to need.
Yes, needs-based.
Needs-based, So just a reminder for everyone out there, what that meant is a baseline per student amount for everyone, and then there would be additional funding loadings reflecting categories of disadvantage, whether it's low income, whether it's disability, indigeneity, low English proficiency, regional or remote location. And what the review said is, the 75% of the additional funding should go to public schools, reflecting the fact that that's where the overwhelming amount of disadvantage is. What has happened instead is that funding has increased 5 times as fast to the private sectors as it has to the public sector, to the point where in 2018, the ABC could report that 1/3 of non-government schools receive more taxpayer funding than at least half of comparable public schools.
Wow.
And this is a really complicated topic. We all have views about it, and we bring lots of different, the deepest values, right? That's how we feel about equality, freedom, and all that. And It's really complicated. I get it. But nobody out there actually says private schools should receive more taxpayer funding than public schools. But somehow that's what we're doing in an awful lot of cases. So you're dead right. This is a bit of a horror story.
And what's your background in terms of what made you want to write the book? You just think this is an issue that we need to that's been forgotten about, we need to talk about more?
So yeah, I started teaching a few years before the Gonski Review. But I guess when the Gonski Review came along, I was, on a steep learning curve professionally, but at that point where I was also increasingly conscious that there are a whole lot of systemic issues that were probably making my job harder and certainly making the job of a lot of my colleagues out there across the country harder. And I got swept up in the process of the Gonski Review and the optimism of it. My school was one of 6,000 public schools across the country that made a submission to the Gonski Review. And, it felt like a really consultative, thorough, methodical process. And then it came up with this report, which seemed to transcend a lot of the sector, the traditional hostility between the sectors, and even got some significant bipartisan support. You think about particularly the New South Wales coalition government of Barry O'Farrell and the Nationals Education Minister Adrian Piccoli supporting Gonski. It felt like a breakthrough. And so I was very much, personally involved in that optimism. And I guess a major vehicle of that for me was my involvement in the Teachers Union, the Australian Education Union, whom I worked for a few years. So I remain a teacher now, but I also write on education issues. And as I was saying, I given my personal involvement and commitment to this issue, it was something at this point that I felt we need to come back to. So I reached out to a guy called Chris Bonner, who's a retired school principal in Sydney, and is a wonderful writer on education. He's written a couple of great books with Jane Caro, and I really admired his work. And I kind of put this idea to him, and very happily he agreed to it. And so that's how Waiting for Gonski came about.
And it kind of all goes back to John Howard. He, correct me if I'm wrong, ever since him, private schools have been receiving more funding. Is that correct? Per student than public schools, or it's been increasing. Before Gonski, it was already coming off large amounts of funding going to private schools, and it's kind of got worse in the last 10 years, correct? Gosh,
where do we start the story? Because, I think the thing to remember is, historically, for a century, from the end of the 19th century until the introduction of state aid in the 1970s, we had this Catholic system that was really underfunded, which was mostly populated by, kids from Irish Catholic backgrounds who are pretty working class. So you had a very disadvantaged Catholic sector particularly. State aid is introduced in the late 60s and early 70s, largely to address that injustice. But it was introduced without thinking about, okay, so we're providing taxpayer funding to these schools. Are there going to be some commensurate public obligations about maybe your fees are regulated, maybe the way you enroll students is regulated, and so on? And what happened over the subsequent half century is that the amount of state aid gradually crept up and up to these schools, where we got to the point, as I was referring to before, that many non-government schools are public schools in the level of funding they receive. They receive just as much public funding as a public school in similar circumstances. And look, to your question, you're absolutely right that in that trajectory over the last half century, the Howard government played a decisive role because they amped up the funding to non-government schools. It doubled. Wow. So by the end of the Howard government, you had a situation where Commonwealth funding, over 2/3 of that was going to non-government schools. Remember, only 1/3 of students are in non-government schools.
Yep.
And just 1/3 of Commonwealth funding was going to public schools. So there was a massive investment of Commonwealth government funding in private schools. And that's helped create this situation today where, most private schools have a very significant resource advantage over public schools, and they enrol much more privileged kids on average. There's huge diversity, of course, but...
Yeah, you only need to drive past your local private school and then your local public school to even see that difference, really.
Yeah. Well, we look at this in the book, but pretty much every town you go to, for instance, the Gonski panel went to Alice Springs. And what you find there is, public schools, both primary and secondary, which have an overwhelming majority of really disadvantaged kids, mostly Indigenous kids. And then you go, just a few minutes drive away and there's a Catholic school, not the highest fees in the world by any means, but enough to mean that it's prohibitive for a lot of people in that community, and there's much fewer Indigenous kids at the Catholic school, much fewer disadvantaged kids generally. And then you have, and it's the classic hierarchy across Australia, there's a high fee independent school where the student profile is even more privileged. So what our school policy has really created in Australia, in every town and suburb, is a kind of socioeconomic hierarchy. And just to be really clear about this, we have the fourth most segregated school system in the OECD. Our schools are more segregated than in Russia or in Tunisia.
Wow.
And what that tells us is, of course, location matters, and there are disadvantaged suburbs and towns, of course, but our education policy, public policy settings are really exacerbating the effect of location and driving disadvantaged kids into the same schools as each other.
And the great thing your book talks about is peer effects, and it talks about how having these different systems kind of drive inequality. It's quite fascinating. And our system just increases inequality, and no political party kind of wants to go near this. Gonski tried to address that, right, but it didn't really have, it was kind of hobbled by its by what Gillard told them to do in terms of not taking any funding away from any schools, correct?
Right. Yeah, so let's break this down. I mean, I think when we think about Gonski, we think about money, of course,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
Is that how we allocate money to schools? But here's the thing, and the Gonski report showed this. One of the most important resources in any school are the kids, right? And, as a teacher, and I think all teachers out there will get this, right? If you have a class full of, high-performing, motivated kids from families who really value education, not only is that a lot easier task than other contexts, those kids feed off each other. There's a kind of a competitive spirit. They bring a whole lot of background knowledge. And so the point here is that learning of any one student is heavily affected by the other students in their cohort. And so going back to what we said about concentrations of disadvantage before, if you take a disadvantaged kid and you stick them in a school with lots of other disadvantaged kids, which is exactly what we're doing, you are making their educational opportunities much, much more narrow, and their chance of success much less. And that's the peer effects you're referring to. And Gonski, one of the outstanding features of the Gonski report is it said it emphasised the power of peer effects. In fact, it pointed to research that said the socioeconomic background of the kids in your class, the other kids in your class, has at least as powerful impact on your learning outcomes as your own family background, your parents' socioeconomic circumstances. That's how big it is. And the thing about Gonski, the report, is it was great in terms of saying we need to allocate the money more sensibly. We need it to be needs-based. But it never got to this deeper question about how education policy settings are driving concentrations of disadvantage in some schools, the unregulated fees, the unregulated enrolment practices, the taxpayer-fueled resource disparities. And that's what's creating these really negative peer effects. So that even if you get the money right, there's these structural issues which remain unaddressed. Now, the further point, which you alluded to, is that even getting the money right has escaped us to this point. As we started out, Gonski said we needed a needs-based sector-blind funding system. What we've done over the last 10 years is the opposite. It's been sector-based and needs-blind.
Yeah, well, that was my next point. I mean, education and Gonski's kind of taken a back seat with the elevation of Morrison as Prime Minister, and then with COVID. Last I heard, Morrison tried to launch this thing called Gonski 2.0 in around 2017, 2018. Turnbull did. What's happened the last few years? Where are we at? Has it just completely been forgotten about?
Yeah, look, I think where we've got to is Morrison created a national school reform agreement a couple of years ago, which let the states off the hook in terms of their obligation to deliver needs-based funding in their schools. So we've now got a situation where public schools, which are overwhelmingly funded by state governments, in most jurisdictions, they won't reach even 90% of the schooling resource standard, the kind of the needs-based standard Gonski set out. They won't reach that until 2030 because the Morrison government has really removed any obligation for state governments to increase their funding. So we have ever-escalating Commonwealth government funding, which is mostly going to private schools, and often meaning that they're overfunded according to the needs-based standard, and public schools continue to be underfunded. And I think, one of the reasons we wanted to write this book, Dylan, is that we felt that we were kind of drifting along in a post-Gonski torpor. People out there kind of had a feeling that Gonski was a great idea. We weren't really sure whether it had been implemented or not implemented or distorted. And the whole impetus, which, there was a really broad-based national consensus which originally arose up around Gonski. And I think one of the most stark illustrations of that is that when Turnbull tried to tack to the centre and differentiate himself from the Abbott government, the issue he chose was school funding and to try and claim the Gonski mantra. But that impetus has really been lost. And so we're writing this book in a way to say this is too important to ignore. We failed in a very basic way. And we need to attend to this and in a sense, start again.
And given we're in the middle of an election campaign, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think Australia's still sliding in the OECD ratings, correct? Why isn't this a bigger election issue, do you think? It should be huge.
Yeah, well, you're right. Australian school students are about a year of learning behind where they were in 2000, according to the OECD's PISA tests. And that's in, reading, maths and science. So this is the gap separating disadvantaged and advantaged students is about 3 years of learning on average. Wow. So it's an acute problem facing our community, and it should be absolutely up there in lights as a major election issue. I think the answer to your question is we know the Albanese opposition is pursuing a small target strategy, and you raise school funding and it's a very divisive issue and
hit lists, winners and losers, all those tropes come out again. Yep.
All that stuff. And look, in fairness to the opposition, to Labor, they've got a strong policy to deliver needs-based funding much more fully and much more quickly than the Morrison government. And a change of government would be a huge win for many, many disadvantaged kids across our community. But it is very much, Labor's very locked into, we're going to deliver more money to all schools and we're going to make everybody happy. And that's politically understandable. But they don't want to address the fundamental issues that really arose out of the Gonski report about this unlevel playing field where we've got unregulated fees, very different enrolment practices and obligations, and continuing resource disparities. And so I don't think ultimately, unless we get to that issue, we're really going to solve the problems we face.
I mean, really, having read your book, it feels like one of the heart or the big issues behind inequality in education is just inequality generally, which I don't think either political party there's a real appetite to tackle. I think petrol prices are a much bigger vote winner.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think what Gonski shows is there's certainly an appetite to tackle inequality in as far as delivering needs-based funding. Not that we're doing it, but there's certainly been a lot of talk about it and the desire from large parts of the community and political parties to deliver needs-based funding, more funding for disadvantaged kids. Yes, address inequality that way. But what the really hard part of it, right, is what our school system at the moment is doing is effectively creating gated communities which are mostly populated by the children of educated and affluent parents, and largely exclude disadvantaged kids. And that is affecting learning outcomes very negatively. And so the inequality we don't want to address is this exclusion, the idea that maybe we should have more socioeconomically mixed schools, which aren't so exclusive, and address these concentrations of disadvantage, which are at the heart of the problems in our schools.
Now, personally, growing up, I wound up going to a selective public high school, which I liked and I was a champion of, and I felt, as coming from a family which probably couldn't afford to send me to a independent school, I was a fan of. But your book really makes an argument that this is sucking students away from the private system. It's basically entrenching inequality. Is there a solution to this? Should selective schools just be for lower socioeconomic people? Or Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, has got rid of the test, the selective schools test there, I believe. What do you think we should do with selective schools?
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, I mean, I think the problem here is that the way public systems, particularly in New South Wales, have responded to the unlevel playing field and the competitive dynamic with the private sectors, who are better resourced and can pick and choose their students, is to become internally selective. And so you have, a lot of selective schools particularly in New South Wales, and they combine with the private sector to really suck the high-performing students out of comprehensive public schools, which makes life very, very difficult in those comprehensive schools. That's the problem. I think, we need to be imaginative about the solutions. I mean, for instance, one really smart thing that the New South Wales government is doing, it's got it's Aurora School, which is for gifted and talented students in rural and remote locations who stay within their local public school but can log online for extension subjects and so on. So to me, it's partly a response to just being geographically isolated, but to me, it also suggests the way that we can try and balance a genuine need to offer extension for really gifted students, but to retain the kind of inclusive character of our schools.
What's the end result here? Do we need to have a massive overhaul, start from the ground up of the education system so we don't lose another decade, or is it just more tinkering that's going to happen?
Well, look, what Chris and I argue for is a level playing field, and what we mean by that is that all publicly funded schools would be prohibited from charging fees. All publicly funded schools would be subject to common enrolment regulations, while allowing for non-government schools to retain their special ethos. So if you're, a Catholic school, you can preferentially enrol Catholic students. And all publicly funded schools to be funded on a needs basis. Now, here's the rub, though. To even imagine achieving that, you have to fully publicly fund all schools. I mean, as long as we continue to partially publicly fund some non-government schools, well, they have to charge fees. Yeah. And once you charge fees and one subset of parents are paying fees, well, it engenders an expectation that they're going to get something in return. And the school they're sending their kids to is going to be better resourced than the school down the road. So once you have that user pays element in the system, you're creating a whole imperative that is exactly contradictory to a needs-based outcome. So it's kind of understandable once one subset of parents has to pay fees that they don't think things should be needs-based. They think it should reflect, the fact that they've coughed up money out of their own pocket. So we're only going to be able to create a level playing field if we say, look, every school, whether it's state-owned and operated or it's non-government, should be fully publicly funded. We're not that far away from it. most non-government schools are 90, 95%, even 100% publicly funded already in recurrent funding. But once you do that, you say, look, yes, everybody, if you conscientiously have a conscientious preference about the kind of education you want your child to receive, whether it's a Steiner school, a Montessori school, or a religious school of one variety or another, you should be entitled to that, and there shouldn't be a financial penalty associated with that. But what we won't permit is for for taxpayer funding to support some kids have resource advantages over others in similar circumstances in what are effectively gated communities that exclude young people from many parts of the community. Because that's just arbitrarily preferring, it's sustaining a kind of elitist system, and that's can't be held to be in the public interest.
No,
and it's really, really harming the learning outcomes of those kids who are excluded and end up in comprehensive free schools.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. Tom, thanks for your time. The book is Waiting for Gonski, How Australia Failed at Schools, which is out on UNSW Press. Make sure you check out the book wherever books are sold, I guess. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Dylan.
Alrighty, a big thank you to Tom Greenwell for being on the show and talking about his book, Waiting for Gonski, How Australia Failed at Schools. Available where all good books are sold. That's it for this episode of Newsfighters. Another reminder, our 100th episode, Best Of, is coming out for free after the election. But if you want it early, it's on our Patreon at patreon.com/newsfighters. Or if you want to support the show, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/newsfighters. Don't forget to vote and keep fighting, and bye for now.
This is News Fighters, where we fight the news so you don't have to.